Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 285.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn. Daisy, what do you have for us?
Well, Terry, I am back with a podcast I haven't listened to or shared for a while, and that's Dr. Rangan Chatterjee's podcast, Feel Better, Live More. This episode is called, you're going to like this, The Power of Mindset, How Your Thoughts Transform Your Physical Health and Why Embracing Uncertainty is the Key to Wellbeing. Need a breath, it's a long title, with Dr. Ellen Langer. I don't know if you've heard of her. Like it is so often the case, it has a different title on YouTube. It's called Don't Learn It Too Late, How to Get Back on Track and Design Your Dream Life. Dr. Ellen Langer is a professor of psychology at Harvard University and widely known as the mother of mindfulness. She's the recipient of 3 Distinguished Scientist Awards and the author of 12 books, including her latest, The Mindful Body, Thinking Our Way to Chronic Health. So this is, as we've said before, Rangan's into these long form episodes, and this was another one. It was over 2 hours. And I will tell you, I actually haven't listened to the whole episode yet. But I was very good at, I used my new best mate, ChatGPT, to help me focus in on just a couple of things to talk about and expand. And I've also been mindful, pun slightly intended, of trying to have more of a discussion. You know, we always pick up on negative, if there's any negativity in reviews or if people make comments. And a couple of people have said, you know, stop talking, more discussion. Or Terry joins in at minute 15 or something, jump straight to that. So, of course, you know, I always take these things personally. But so I've tried to set it up so a little bit more room for discussion as we go, rather than just rattling through a presentation. But I will tell you that the amount of it that I've listened to is really packed with great stuff. She's very, very interesting. Lots of wisdom here. And just, yeah, if you don't know her already, you're going to love her. And I really do recommend people go and listen to this episode. But I'm going to kick off with a direct quote from something she says. When we realize we don't know, life becomes interesting again and effortless. People know they don't know, but think they should know. And they think other people do know. And so we pretend. We avoid situations rather than approaching them. What people need to realize is that everything is always changing. Everything looks different from different perspectives, so we can't know. And she goes on to talk about that in school we're taught absolute facts. 1 + 1 = 2. But context is key, and 1 + 1 actually doesn't always equal 2. And she talks about lots of examples, but a few fun ones here. 1 wad of chewing gum plus another wad of chewing gum just makes 1 bigger wad of chewing gum. 1 pizza, this was apparently someone sent this one into her. 1 pizza and another pizza is 2 pizzas. But 1 lasagna with another lasagna on top is just 1 bigger lasagna. So just thinking about the context and getting curious. And this has come up before, the importance of being curious. And I've mentioned before that I was one of these kids who was always asking, but why? But why? And we do tend to lose that a bit. But when we know we don't know, we have choices. And you can ask questions that make the discussion more interesting. And then you pay attention to the context. When you are doing this, you're actively noticing and your neurons are firing, which is always a good thing. And Rangan brings something up, something that he lives by. He says that he's always valued the importance of keeping a beginner's mind, a beginner's mindset. You know, really appreciating the fact that There's always stuff to learn, to know. And she mentioned about during COVID, burnout was discussed often. And she maintains that burnout results from mindlessness. Doing the same thing over and over becomes hard to tolerate. When you recognize things are always changing and you can't be sure of what's going to happen in any given situation, you start paying attention and you start engaging differently. Realizing you don't know makes you pay attention, and this is mindfulness. And so it's thinking about, how much do we get trained out of curiosity as we grow up, and the importance of asking questions. Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting thing maybe to talk about a little bit, about thinking about as we're growing up. To a certain extent, we have that natural curiosity that most children have sort of schooled out of us a bit.
I think one of the important things that you're already highlighting from this is it seems to kind of, or she may be trying to break us out of some of our old habits of just moving forward with things based on our own assumptions and how we understand it. That there's always more. There's always another way to look at it. And again, just as simple as this plus this equals this. And some of us look at things very literally.
Yeah.
And it then limits the perspective that we can take. It leaves out context clues and other information. And so I like so far what you're sharing, in that it just kind of pushes toward there's more. And if you're open, and if you maybe learn some ways to add perspectives, you will see more, understand more, connect with more, rather than being limited by those built-in automatic assumptions that we have.
See, I knew you'd like her, and I knew you'd sort of be thinking along the same wavelengths, because that's the kind of thing that, one of the things anyway, that they go on to be talking about. And Rongan brings up, he says, and I knew you'd agree with this, that mindset influences every single aspect of our lives. And he says, and they get into this, sounds like a very complicated conversation. He says he's come around to this way of thinking that there's no such thing as wasting time. You spend time and there's a consequence. You either like the consequence and you want to repeat it, or you imagine he's going to go on to say, or you don't like the consequence and you learn from that you're not going to repeat it. And she butts in and she says, but when you are mindless, you are wasting time. And he says you could take that argument one step further and say that if you're spending time mindlessly and you realize you were spending it mindlessly, then it wasn't a waste, because you've learned it's better to spend your time mindfully. Yes, Rongan, but most of the time, she says, you don't realize it. That's the problem. Most of the time, we don't get a chance to review. When we're mindless, it doesn't occur to us to come up with a solution. And it doesn't occur to us that we might be able to change the current situation, i.e. when we're doing things mindlessly, when we're not asking questions. Because we're trained to think in absolutes and not cultivate curiosity and not suggest change. So you see, really thinking the same way that the kind of things that you just brought up. People don't realize that virtually everything that was at one point a decision. And for it to be a decision means that there was uncertainty. So follow the logic, she says. Virtually everything is mutable. Everything can be changed. Most people take it as is, as if there is some larger reason for how things are. If it doesn't work, change it. But it doesn't work if it doesn't occur to you that it can be changed. She says the more deferent you are to the person who created the rule, the more important it is you don't follow it. And she says, let me give you an example to tell you what I mean by that. And she says that when she goes and does presentations, she says she almost always does the same thing. She invites somebody who's tall to come up and join her. And she's quite short in comparison. And so she says, we're standing next to each other and there's a big differential. And she asks the audience, well, should we do anything the same way? She poses the question, if he decided how to do something, like hold a tennis racket, for example, and she did it the same way, she's never going to maximize her potential performance. And Rongan says, yes, we need to stop living by mindless rules. There are these beliefs that we absorb and we accept them to be true without questioning them just because everybody says that. He says as he was growing up, he grew up with this belief that, and he's very tall. He said, I was wondering where you were going with that. And I could sort of see the cogs in his mind ticking away when he said that, because I know he's tall. I didn't realize how tall, but he's 6'7" apparently, so really tall. He was saying, I wonder where you were going with this tall person analogy here. But he said he grew up sort of thinking that tall people tend to get back pain. And as he grew up, he had back pain, and he said, hold on a minute, who says this and why do they say that? And now I'm going to challenge that. And he doesn't have back pain. And, this is something that we've touched on before. Well, it's just because we're getting older, or it's, and I'm guilty of this, or it's menopause brain, or it's this, it's just, it's this, it's this general consensus that things happen. So Rongan says, but so can we change our approach to life and our mindset? And Ellen says that really you can only change it if you realize that you're trapped in it. And the way to get out of that is curiosity, the willingness to try new things and change, recognize change, awareness of when things are different. Nobody is any one thing all the time. What is different? Why is something different now? It leads you to try and find some answers and solutions and then be able to change. And she talks about something called attention to symptom variability. She says it's just a fancy way of saying being mindful. Because when you're mindful, you notice change. And she talks about people with chronic illness or chronic pain and the importance of this awareness of those different moments and then getting curious about why that might be happening. So drop the mistaken belief that a chronic illness means there is no solution to the problem. It just means the medical world doesn't have a solution yet. So you presume that the symptoms are going to stay the same or get worse. But she said nothing moves in only one direction. So often we're waiting for some medical answers, but maybe we can do something while we're waiting. And Rongan talks about the importance of language. I am currently suffering with chronic pain versus I have chronic pain. Again, this is something that we've talked about. And Rongan, again, says that he thinks awareness is the most important factor in any change and how these mindful choices can restore agencies. And she says the questions you ask yourself are also important. They're talking, a bit about the importance of language here. She says, think about these two questions. How am I wonderful versus how am I miserable? What answers you go looking for are very dependent on the question you've asked yourself. So whatever question you ask yourself, you will be able to validate it. So if you ask yourself, how am I wonderful? You'll find ways that you can validate that. If you ask yourself, how are you miserable? You'll find ways to validate that. So I felt this section was so relevant to us, you and I, but also probably most of our listeners. We're either quite new to this questioning, especially of the medical diagnosis that we might have been given, or things that the medical environment is saying, like, yes, you have a progressive disease and there's nothing you may be able to manage it, or, you may be able to stop it getting too much worse, or it is going to progress, whatever. These things might sound very familiar, but we've been challenging these kind of things for quite a while. Other people might be a bit newer to this, but really, like I say, since I was a child, I've been asking why. I've been questioning things. I mentioned Gretchen Rubin a lot. I'm, down the middle, questioner and rebel. So I'm very used to questioning what somebody tells me. But I really like these things that she's saying, that it's important to question, and it can make things fun. And there's actually a big section about stress and work versus the whole work-life balance that is so interesting in and of itself, that I'm going to come back with talking about that next time. But I thought these were good things to pull out that I thought would interest you and people at home.
Mm-hmm. Daisy, obviously, that I talk a lot about mindset. And, that is such a gigantic topic. But even that example of how you ask a question, what perspective you're asking yourself to use when looking at information, changes how you look at it.
Yeah.
And again, I think many of us, most of us, all of us, probably most often don't realize that we enter into every conversation, every thought process with a bias that then shapes where we go from there. It reminds me even of you for many years hosting a podcast where you would ask people questions, and what you would get from them varies based on what you ask and how you ask it, versus if you had just said to them, write a 15-minute presentation that you would say about this topic. But because you chose specific things to check in, and then even perhaps what angle you were coming to it from shifted during the conversation as they added things and kind of shaped your direction, it really just shows how dynamic conversations are, debates. When you were describing their kind of repartee, I guess, of kind of, yes, but
it was fun.
Rangan, what about this? Or, it reminds me a little bit of early in my life, hearing some people talk about taking a philosophy class. And I've never taken one. And this is probably why. Because it felt like people were so focused on almost what sounded to me like nitpicking. Yes, but what do you mean by that? And I think my brother shared an example like this. And I don't know if this has happened or not, but the philosophy professor said for their final exam, something like, describe this chair. And my brother said his answer was, what chair? And handed in the book. And to me, that just felt like, oh no, there need to be, it's this or this. And because of this, we know this. And sometimes I can get caught up in that, asking the deeper questions based on context. But sometimes that feels uncomfortable to me, because it just feels like, where are we going? Will this seeking context or understanding ever come to a solution? But I enjoyed listening to your just even summarizing how they engaged in this conversation of really pushing us to keep hearing what's beyond the initial words or concepts.
Yes, and I suppose it appeals to my questioning nature, but I just really like this concept of, obviously we can't necessarily be in this frame of mind all the time, but there's just being aware, just being mindful and being curious and asking questions and thinking about the questions that you're asking. You talk often about, your brain's listening. It's important that we feed it the right kind of language. And, she was focusing in on some of these chronic illnesses and people suffering from chronic pain, and some of the conversations she would have, and trying to get them to focus on, yes, you're never one thing all the time. And so, a typical question might be, well, do you feel better or worse than last time we spoke? And there's going to be an answer to that. I mean, maybe it will be exactly the same, but it's unlikely. So whichever way it goes, okay, let's dig into that a bit. Well, maybe you're feeling better. Well, okay, well, what's going on? What's the context? Maybe there's something we can harness here. I was telling you before we started recording that I've been experimenting with a period of time going dairy-free because I got suspicious that it was been getting some twinges in my knee and was actually getting a little bit concerned because they would twinge and be painful as I was up the stairs. Wasn't so bad, but coming down the stairs, and I was actually afraid that my knee might give out and I would fall down the stairs and could quite literally die. I hope my dogs would eat me, by the way. But it suddenly dawned on me that I'd put it down to it happened when I started exercising, but it also suddenly dawned on me that it was also at the time when I significantly upped my dairy with some protein shakes that I was having to, because I needed to increase the amount of protein I was having. And I thought, got curious about that. And then, okay, well, let's do a bit of experimentation. We're both familiar with the whole N=1. Let's play around with this a bit and see what happens. Let's get curious. And yes, lo and behold, things have changed. And interestingly, some other things have changed. I've noticed effects on my mood as well. But it's only by being aware. So the awareness is key, and being aware of when changes happen, because there are changes. Nothing is ever always the same. But you've got to be aware of times when they change, and then thinking about when those changes happen and starting to ask questions and starting to ask the right questions. And then maybe you'll find some answers, and maybe you'll find some solutions, and maybe you might start feeling a bit better, or something will happen, whatever it is, whatever that progression is, something will change for the better. But it only happens, there's a progression here, and there are some things that we need to put into action. And the big thing that we need to avoid is mindlessness. And we need to avoid just taking for read that that's how it is, or that's just what happens, or they say, so that's how it is, or the medical establishment doesn't have a solution that's going to work, so we've just got to accept it, whatever it is. So yes, I thought this might appeal.
I will definitely
appeal to me.
Have to add it to my ever-growing list of interesting things to listen to, interesting things to read. I feel like every time we have a conversation, every time I share something at work, when people have other resources and things, it just keeps adding to, I'm never going to know enough and understand enough, which is, I guess, kind of good overall, because it means I'm going to keep learning.
Exactly, which is a good thing. I never feel as good, actually, I've realized, as when I'm learning new stuff, whatever it is, whether it be something physical, mental, something to do with work. I never feel as energized as when I'm learning something new and challenging myself in that way. As long as it's something that I can make some achievements on, I get very frustrated if it's something I can't do. But again, that's another episode, isn't it, with setting yourself up to succeed rather than fail. But so anyway, I'll leave it there, but I will be coming back with more from this episode. It's like I say, I haven't even finished the 2-hour+ episode yet, but already the parts that I have listened to, I've got another episode to bring to you from it. So maybe there'll be even more than that. But yeah, I recommend that people go and listen to this one. It's a goodie.
Very cool.
Okay, well, until I see you next time, I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.